Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Welcome to my basement for a slightly improvised recorded lecture. Today, we're in Intro to Rhetoric, and we're going to talk about rational argument. We have two objectives. By the end of this class, you should be able to identify the rhetorical appeals and strategies, and you should be able to discuss form and function of rational argument. We're going to begin in the first Roman numeral. So there are three basic Aristotelian appeals in Aristotle's On Rhetoric, and they're the intro to rhetoric strategies that we're going to go into. The first is the question of ethos. Ethos is the appeal to credibility. We have two things that we're going to look at here. There is narrative, which is an appeal to ethos and credibility because you're telling a person how they, what your story is. And then credibility, just straight up, there's a lot of ways to establish credibility, internal, external, goodwill, good character. We went through all of those in our last unit. Narrative can also show up in other ways. We might see it in pathos. Pathos is the appeal to emotions. But here we've got mostly our work on aesthetics. So aesthetics in visual aesthetics, but also in vocal aesthetics will show up there. But then also appeals to values, needs, and symbols. And there's some classic approaches to generating an emotional response for these. And then there's also just classic logos, the appeal to logic. And a couple of the ways that we might do that is with rational argument, which is the main focus today, but also in confrontation. Now, confrontation is risky. We're going to talk about it, but we're going to talk about it much later because it's not a mainstream strategy. Let's move on to the next Roman numeral, rational argument. What is rational argument and what it's used for? Well, in rhetoric, argument means more than like a verbal fight or bickering. Maybe your parents, told you that you should quit arguing with your, sibling or something all the time. But in rhetoric, the term argument is actually kind of a technical term. It's the use of rhetoric and reason. It's use of evidence and reasoning to persuade an audience of a claim. And we might notice some functions of rhetoric. We might notice some functions of rational argument. It's the primary method that humans have developed for solving problems. And I'm actually going to argue that it's a type of rhetorical technology in a way of establishing, connections between people. And it's really at the core of democratic decision-making. When we think our democracy is working best, we think it's working best because of an appeal to rational argument and kind of the way things ought to work from there. The argument formula has a couple of steps to it. The first one is the claim. The claim, evidence, and a warrant. So they have to have those three things to be considered an actual argument. So a claim is the conclusion drawn from the evidence and reasoning. It's the thing, we list it first here, but it's the thing you're trying to prove. It's the answer you're trying to prove, and it's debatable. A claim is debatable, and it could be argued from there. You might say that Intro to Rhetoric is a great class. That's the claim that you're going to make to it. And you use evidence, the second part of the rhetoric formula, is the data that supports the argument. These might be examples or statistics or comparisons or statements of authority or anything like that. We might say that there's very little homework in Intro to Rhetoric. The teacher is smart and quite handsome, and the material is very useful. That's good evidence for it. And then the warrant is the way that you connect the evidence to the claim for it. We might say that it's the explanation to prove it. It links the evidence to claim. You say, that the good teaching and the useful subject matter makes Intro to Rhetoric a joy. It's a great class. But if it doesn't have all three of those points, if it doesn't have the claim, the evidence, and the reasoning, then it's actually not a coherent argument. An argument without a claim doesn't try to prove anything. It's analyzed data. And analyzed data is not nothing, but it's not an argument. And an argument without evidence is just emotional appeal. Now, emotional appeal itself is not nothing. It's a valid approach, but you shouldn't confuse it with what argument actually is. And then an evidence without a warrant leaves the point unfinished. It doesn't draw the conclusion that you need to make an argument an actually working argument. How does argument work? There's three basic approaches. There's an evidence-oriented argument. It's the classic form of argument. It's what I use all the time as a debate coach. Oriented argument is the classic form. It works the best when the issue is factual and the rhetoric has new information for an audience. There's also an enthematic argument, which draws on pre-existing knowledge. An enthematic argument assumes the rhetor and the audience have some mutually shared knowledge between them. Enthymemes work very well for reinforcing a view that people already hold. So they're good for solidifying people's opinions onto it. And then thirdly is a refutation argument. It's the approach that denies the position of the other side. This is a common method in debates where opposing sides try to refute each other. Refutation works best when the audience is undecided and trying to consider two or more perspectives. It's not very helpful if you've got an audience that's already made up their mind on it. Which actually brings us to our last point. Is rational argument effective? Is this actually a way to persuade an audience? Well, rational argument is one of our favorite ways to make decisions and influence ideas. It forms the basis of scientific decision making, for instance. It's the form of research paper, and every English teacher since you've been writing research paper has coached you more or less on the claim evidence argument method, even if they haven't used that term for it. But the truth is, and I think the polling backs this up, it's actually not very effective at getting people to change their minds. And once a person forms an opinion, it's actually very, very hard to get them to change their mind. When it does happen, it happens very slowly and by continued exposure to opposing arguments, and usually relies on a mix of other strategies along the way. Rational argument is great when it works well, but it's part of a larger formula. That's all we got today. Thanks. God bless you. Go Thunder.